Thank you, Brian. Well, thank you for letting me come and speak to you all. And Carrie, thank you for the invitation and Life Team members. How many people here are members of the Life Team? Then, great. Sort of. They'll count you, right? Um, well, it's a privilege to be here, and as the clerk, as Brian mentioned, as the clerk of Presbytery, I often get a chance to hear a lot about churches, and I've heard a lot of wonderful things about Twin Oaks, and I've visited you all when you're not here a lot of times when Presbytery is here. But it's great to be able to be here with you and worship with you later. And I'll also say that you guys have wonderful pastors here, Scott and Russ and Bill, Bob. I mean, all of them are just amazing men, and I'm just grateful to have known them and kind of serve alongside them as well. So it's a real privilege for me to be here. And so thank you for your warm welcome and your invitation to speak. Just to tell you a little bit about where I'm serving and a little bit more of who I am. As was mentioned, I serve as a chaplain, actually kind of the director of pastoral care in a community called Friendship Village Chesterfield. We are a retirement community, and so we serve a continuum of care, which means when you move in, hopefully you're just simply retired and living independently, and we want to provide for meals and security and give you opportunities to enjoy your retirement. And then as you get sick or as you need more help or need more assistance, then we have a tier of different levels of care ranging from assisted living, where you may need somebody to come in and help regulate your medications, for example, or just do something small around your physical needs. And then we have all the different other forms of care, like skilled nursing and memory care and rehab care and things to that effect. And the idea behind it, which was started by a number of people in the PCA as well as from other denominations, the idea was that we wanted to take care of the people of our church as well in such a way that we would help them to finish the course that the Lord has given them well. So we have about 500 residents between all of those different levels of care throughout our community. And we do have a sister site, so many of you probably know more, or probably if you visited Friendship Village from here, you probably visited our Sunset Hills campus, which is a little larger than ours. So this morning, I'm hoping to talk to you a little bit about identity, gospel, and aging. That's what the Life Team's asked me to speak on, and from looking at the schedule of the speakers that you have and the topics, I'm really looks like kind of a bridge between the vulnerability of ministering to people who are vulnerable and in need of advocates and justice being brought to end-of-life issues. And so I think that's, Carrie, if that's fair, I'm a bit of a bridge here. And the way that I see my role, and I've learned this being working with older adults and seniors, is that I see myself less as an expert and more of a student. And I'm hoping even as we kind of look at this topic today, it maybe hopefully changes in some of your minds to think of yourselves less as what do I assume I know to what more do I need to know, which is what I think any healthy discipleship in the Lord is. It's not about what we know about the Lord. It's about what we don't know and what we're seeking to know more about Him and His faithful provision for us. And so 3 kind of sections I'm going to try and walk us through. And I'd also invite you, if you have questions or if you have thoughts or comments or experiences, I want to learn from you as much as hopefully I want to share some of the experiences I've had. And so feel free to interact or engage. And I may remind me to repeat the question so that it's recorded. But there's 3 sections I want us to look at, starting with the challenge of aging, one in our own lives and then in our culture, and then what a healthy theology of aging might look like from the Bible. How do we think of aging in terms of what the Word of God says? And then how do we start to integrate how we apply, or how do we apply and integrate a theology of aging into the challenges of what we are experiencing in our world together? So those are the three sections. So has anyone recognized any of these folk? I hope so. Oh yeah, Rita. And Ray and Betty Dorr, yeah. And June Tesson, I forgot to put her picture up here, but those three and June are four people who have had an impact in my life as I've walked with them through the last stage of their lives. I miss them dearly, but those are my Twin Oaks folks. Like I said, you probably have more being sent or relatives being sent to our Sunset Hill branch, but yeah, it's been a privilege to have known them. And so even as we're thinking about aging and thinking about end of life, these are some of the people we're thinking about if you remember them well. They're not, it's often we can stereotype or take a lot of images of what it means to be old and disassociate it with the reality of who these people are. These are unique people. And if you knew Betty and you knew Rita, you know that they're totally different people. And that's how it is with our end stages of our lives. Is we have to remember that what we're talking about when we're talking about aging is people. We're talking about the uniqueness of how God made us. And so when we talk about identity, and any identity, it's a complex subject. An identity of who I am and what I'm called to do and how I'm called to live and what I know about the world, they're all intertwined. There's a sense in which I am what I do. As a chaplain, I have to be an identity of a chaplain if I do chaplain work. I have to go and visit the sick and bring God's word to them and pray for them. But there's a sense in which it's also an identity marker for who I am. The B. It helps me think differently about the world and think differently about who I am and to learn to rest and be present with the Lord. And it's what I know and the study that the Lord has blessed me with at Covenant Seminary and learning about all that God has given us in His Word and through creation. And so our identities, they reflect all of those things. The more I do something, the more it affects who I am, my identity, my being, and it also reflects what I know. The more I study something, the more I'm going to act on that knowledge. The more to change who I am, the more I'm still in myself and learning to be at peace with myself, the more it's going to affect what I do and what I know. So our identities are complex. And they're constantly changing and they're constantly growing and experiencing loss. And there's two real aspects. There's many aspects of this, but two that I'll focus on with internal identity development and then external identity development. Meaning, in other words, from an individual, my internal identity is the self-affirmations or self-non-affirmations, dismissals, that I might say. I'm good at such and such. That's declaring something about who I am, my identity. I'm good at soccer. I'm good at playing piano. Those are identity statements I'm making. I'm not good at certain things. I cannot do certain things. And there's descriptive adjectives that help tell me who I am. I'm tall. I tend to watch out for ceiling fans more than, I don't like to get down low and crawl underneath things to fix things in my house. Those are, again, reflections of my individual identity. It's what I say and what I can and cannot do. But then I also live in a world that tells me who I am, right? There's a community that helps form my identity. So I'm not a pastor in isolation. I've got a presbytery that has ordained me to this work. So they're the ones who actually decide I'm a pastor or I'm a chaplain. If you are a worker, we're hired by a community, whether they think of themselves as a community or not. Someone wanted to affirm your role and your identity in work. I cannot be a parent unless I have a child. It takes someone else to tell me who I am and my identity. And so there's communal influences in shaping our identity. And in that, they also, whether they subtly speak or whether they explicitly speak, there is affirmation and dismissal of who I am all the time going on in my world. And that becomes particularly challenging for older adults. First, we have an issue of what to call older adults these days. In years past, they were called seniors or the elderly. Well, as baby boomers are getting older, they don't want to be called elderly. They don't want to be called seniors. And so much of the discussion right now in a sociological world is trying to figure out what to even call older adults. And so older adult is often what gets used instead of senior or retirement age, focusing on what they do rather than an identity like senior. And so we're wrestling with how to even call or how to even talk about older adults, because in and of itself, people want to dismiss the name and the word because of the associations that people have made with those names. In addition to that, we have all sorts of stereotypes and cultural expectations of what aging should or might look like. These are a few of the ones, but these are ones that I engage with on a regular basis. We're unhelpful. We're a drain to society. You know, when you've worked all of your life and you've been a producer and contributor, when you've tithed your money to the church for years and years and years, decades, and then suddenly you're on a fixed income and you can no longer afford to tithe perhaps, or maybe you can't afford to support missionaries that you once did before. What's my role? What am I able to produce to generate service to the Lord or service to the greater world and community? And it's a struggle for many older adults, and it's a struggle for even churches and for individuals to help people understand their role within society. Additionally, there's the myth of mental degradation. You know, some of you probably heard the phrase, you can't teach old dogs new tricks. Well, you actually can teach old dogs new tricks, but there's an assumption that our society often puts on older adults that they're older dogs and older dogs that they can't do new things. They can't learn new ideas. They can't engage in technology, right? And that's totally a myth. Disconnected from reality, you know, that they can't really speak into our world as it is culturally. Again, this is a myth, but the idea of, well, yeah, you may have been a nurse for 50, 60 years, but nursing regulations have changed. We do things differently, therefore, we don't want to hear your input. A new world order has begun, and we don't need your input into the way we do business or how we live our lives today. Or maybe it's technology. And the rapid, I'm a little nervous of what technology is going to be like when I'm in my 70s or 80s. I mean, think about the rate at which, when I actually have my undergrad is in computer science. And at that time, which was about 15 years ago, technology was increasing at such a rate that every 15 months, new technology was being developed to outdate the old technology. That was 15 years ago. And that distance of 15 months was shrinking, 14 months, 13 months. New technology is being produced all the time. And the adaptability to it, there's a stereotype that says, well, older adults can't do that. And what does that say then to the older generation? They have no place here. They have no part of this discussion. In addition to that, pop culture, relevancy of what's going on. You know, we often we don't realize this, but most movies that are the blockbuster movies are geared towards a younger generation's plot lines and development of the thought process is that if you can catch a younger generation and write a plot to their level of understanding, it's going to draw more people in. And so a lot of even our pop culture is geared towards a younger generation. I was going to show a video. I love to show it when I teach at Covenant Seminary, but I wasn't sure if I'd be able to do it here with the technology, so I'll just share it with you. But Evian Water is a bottled water company, and they did a commercial where this man's walking down a street and he looks in a mirror and he sees a little baby reflection in himself. And it says, anyone seen this? It's kind of a funny commercial. Look up Evian water commercial when you get done here. And in this commercial, he starts moving, the baby starts dancing, and the baby's wearing his clothes, and then a girl comes by and she sees a baby, and they all start dancing. And all these people start to gather around this mirror, seeing their reflection. And then it cuts to Evian water, and then the next shot is of an older woman walking her dog, and she looks in the mirror, and there's a baby. And so she starts dancing, but instead of the baby dancing, the baby reflection just stops and stares at her like, what are you doing? You're not supposed to be dancing to this. And the comment is that if you drink Evian water, you'll feel and look younger. And that's what we try and do with our older adults, don't we? We try and say, hey, if you're too old, you don't have a place in society. You've got to look younger. You've got to be younger. You've got to have more energy, and you have to have, you can't have your crown of glory, and you can't have wrinkles. You can't dress the style of the previous generation. Everything has to look younger and more modern. And so we've got a real problem in our society because more and more, instead of looking forward to growing old, we are resenting looking old and wanting to look younger. I've caught our staff even talking about this at Friendship Village, where they'll talk about, well, 50 is the new 40, or 40 is the new 20. Again, it's just a subtle way of just saying to grow old is bad. We want to talk about growing younger. We want to act as if we were in our 20s again. And then the other myth of aging is that elderly equals sickly. That when you get old, you really focus on the 3 P's: pain, pills, and problems. And that's the stereotype. And so what do these influences do to our identity? What are we saying about ourselves as we grow older? If that's what the culture's saying, if that's what they're telling us, even when we watch TV or when we engage in going out to a movie or even billboards, we're being told consistently, don't get old. That's a phrase, by the way, I hear almost every other day. Jake, don't get old from our residents. It's no fun getting old. You don't want to get old. As if I have a choice in the matter. And then, so these are other quotes that I've pulled from my residents that I'd say are some of the largest challenges I hear on a consistent basis. I'm no good anymore. Well, who's telling them that they're not good anymore? One, the fact that their role has shifted and changed, and they don't understand this new role and stage of their life. And what they did do, they're retired from, and they're not the professional at anymore, or they're not contributing the way that they were, and so they don't see that they're good anymore. They have no purpose, is what they're saying. What's the point of living? Why hasn't God taken me home yet? I hear that from so many different people. Why am I even here? Why hasn't God just zipped me right off this planet? And so think about what that does to your psyche when that becomes the dominant question you ask yourself over and over again every day. You really become shaped by these questions in your core identity. And we begin to wonder, well, why, I mean, this is the modern culture speaking, but why do we have these older adults? And that's why the rise of assisted suicide, that's the discussion. People are in pain. and they don't see their purpose anymore, why not just let them be happy and die? And as the church, we've got something very important to say to that, which we're going to talk about in a second. And in addition to that, you really do have some physical challenge. You have often lack of sleep or lack of energy because you're not sleeping. And that affects the way your brain works, and it has profound implications for how then you see yourself. Remember that no be do. So if I can't rest, if my medication's bothering me, or if I've lost sleep over some loss in my life, then it's going to impact what I'm physically able to do the next morning, which then impacts what I know about myself, which then impacts my ability to be anxious and rest and take sleep. So we're in a cycle of identity loss. And this is one of the things that I also have noticed over the years. There's a persistent fear of significant serious illness or disease or injury. So when you start talking to all your peers and your friends as an older adult, and everyone's either had cancer or they're starting to get Parkinson's or their spouse has dementia, you start reading through a lens of every little problem that I start to have is, do I have dementia? Do I have Parkinson's? Do I have cancer? And it starts to shape the fear of how I start to see myself again. And in addition to that, I become paranoid, and perhaps not officially paranoid, but I become scared of every time there's a snowfall. I'm going to slip and fall on the ice, or I can't drive as far as I used to drive because I might get lost. There's persistent fears that can exist within our that age that we don't have when we're younger. And in addition to that, the reality of what I'm speaking to myself is also in emotional challenges. The way that I experience grief and loss. I've been talking with a few seminary professors at Covenant Seminary, and one of the things that I think we would all agree on is that grief, learning how to process grief should start when you're young in order to help process the significant losses when you get older. And the amount of losses that a older adult can experience can directly be the opposite of what a young adult can experience leaving college and getting married and finding a first job and having their first children. There's so many identity changes that in that stage of life, and it's almost the exact opposite that's happening, the amount of losses. And when you're young, you're nervous about, okay, how am I going to make it? How am I going to provide for my family? All those kind of questions that start to form as you're forming your career for yourself. But then once you've made it, and once you've seen God's faithfulness throughout your life, now all of a sudden all these losses start to hit, and you start experiencing significant depression, grief, anxiety. What am I going to lose next? So some of these are a loss of spouse, loss of dignity or respect. Culture's no longer making movies for you. The church is no longer singing your music. I don't know about Twin Oaks. All right, that's good. We'll talk about music here in a little bit, but I'll preface that discussion just by saying I have a lot of residents who attend our Sunday. I've got somebody preaching for me today, so I could be here. But on Sunday mornings we do services, and I have a lot of residents who come to our service not because they can't physically drive to their home churches. And one lady explicitly said, "I feel like they don't want me anymore." And it was all determined because of the music that was being played. Now, that was her feeling. That's not true. But it's what she picked up by all of the modern music that was being integrated in, and they had completely removed all of the what are called hymns of the faith, the great hymns. And she felt dismissed by that. No, the church didn't intend that. But it was an implication of not thinking through their older adults. So, but a lack of what they would experience is sometimes dignity or respect, a loss of choice. Okay, I'm in our setting, moved into a community where we try and make the dining and the food tasty, and actually it's really good. But the challenge is that it can often be the same things over and over. I don't get to choose to go out like I used to, or choose what I want to eat. It's kind of handed to me. Moving in with a family, I no longer get to choose to live on my own anymore. I don't get to choose when I leave or get up anymore or go to bed. And there's a point where we reach that stage in our lives where we don't get to make those choices. And there's a loss of independence. One of the things that we experience, especially in what we call our care center, which is more assisted living and skilled nursing, you can't live independently. You are, in some cases, completely dependent on another person to take care of you, to get you up, to take you to the restroom, to shower and shave you. You don't get to make those choices. So there's a loss of the dignity and independence in your life. And if we all live long enough, if the Lord keeps us here and doesn't return, we're all going to go through that. We're all going to go through a stage where we're completely dependent on another person. That should just make us think about what that will look like in our lives so we can start to think through what it means for others. Henry Nouwen was a chaplain and pastor and author, taught at Harvard, and he worked with a lot of disability, people with disabilities. And he describes old age as the last segregation, which I thought was an interesting way of putting it. It says when you have a group that experiences shame of losses, what happens? You don't have a voice that's willing to engage in the discussions. So we've got a table where we have the leaders of all the different generations and we can add races and nations to discuss what the world should look like or be like. The older adults are probably the least likely to stand up and say, we deserve a spot at that table. They're not going to fight often for having a voice. Why? Because they're already feeling purposeless. They're already feeling like their heyday has come and gone. So why should they have a voice and a place? They're the most likely to have that. And they're the most likely to not have advocates in our culture today, thinking through their needs well and thinking through what they're going through. So when a culture is persistently trying to look, feel, and be younger, often you have a culture that will not see a need for them to have a voice. Right? So if our culture is saying you need to be younger and you need to think younger and you need to act younger, you need to engage new ideas in the workplace, who's going to start to think through, well, what about the older adults? What about the generation that came before us? And so as a culture, we've got an issue because we don't even think about having a voice at this table to shape our culture and our world. Erik Erikson, he is anyone familiar with him? He's a developmental psychologist, and he came up with a theory of life stages. And what he did was he actually looked at and being not in these younger stages himself, looked and saw how many different stages there are when you're younger, and how you grow so rapidly. I've got a 8-month-old, a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old, and almost an 8-year-old, and they're all on different. They're just in different stages of learning and development, and you can clearly see the difference between our 2-year-old and our 8-year-old. Well, when he got to describing old age, he took 65 years and lumped it in with everything older than that. And he developed this theory that when you get older, he was not yet 65, by the way, when you get older, the real issue that you have as you get older is what he would call ego integrity versus despair. And describe that as you're really just trying to not despair over the decisions you made when you were younger. You're trying to come to resolution and say at this end of your life, all the things that you did and be satisfied on some level with all the choices you made and kind of get over the resentments that you had. And that's your purpose. 65 to 100, that's your purpose. Now, I mean, I don't want to ask you to raise your hand if you're older than 65, but think about that. I mean, people, I've got a 108-year-old in our community. That's 40 years of your life where you're supposed to be thinking back on the first 65. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous to think about, but okay, that's what the leading developmental psychologist for life stages developed for older adults. When he got to that age, by the way, he realized how wrong he was. And how many stages there actually are within the older generation. And the focal point not being, okay, my job is on some level to look back and think through the decisions I've made and come to some resolution on them, but I've got a lot of life to be lived. My 108-year-old resident, she sees her life, and she's a believer, wonderful lady. She sees her life is looking forward to what tomorrow is going to bring, how the Lord is going to engage her tomorrow. I mean, that's a wonderful thing. So those are some of the challenges, but then we've also got this immediate challenge that's unique to this day and age in our world, because life expectancy is really changing. In 1930, your average, the life expectancy for males was 58, females 62. Sorry, man. But in the 30s, you were expected to live maybe to your early 60s, right? Well, in 2012, the average life expectancy was 75. So there's been a huge increase, and it's growing. This is an old statistic, but in 2011, a baby boomer turned 65 every 20 seconds in our nation. We have more people 65 years and older who are considered older adults than we do have 18 or younger. That's the first time. There are more retirement communities in our country than there are kindergartens and nurseries. First time ever in our nation. We have this real need. And then in addition to that, Social Security Administration is planning to receive 10,000 applications to Social Security every day for the next 20 years. So we've got this massive influx coming. And that's why talking about this issue is so pertinent and so important today. And so the fastest growing age group in our world, in our country right now, is centenarians, people who are living older than 100. The fastest growing age group. So, a theology of aging. How do we put this in the story of God's overarching narrative in our world? If we look at biblical theology, we look at God created the world, right? So He created the world good. He created aging to be good. We were meant to live forever. Growing old is not the issue. In fact, growing old is exactly what we're supposed to do. It's not a bad thing to be old. In fact, growing old gives us experience and wisdom. I won't read these passages for the sake of time, but I will say 1 Kings 12 is one of my favorite passages to talk about older adults. That's the passage where Solomon has died, Rehoboam has become king, and he's decided that he's going to take two groups and listen to see if he should either increase the labor of the northern tribes, or if the older generation is suggesting, no, don't increase your the labor there. They were speaking from David and Solomon's experience, and they were telling him, look, you need to think through what that'll do to the 10 tribes. And the younger generation, the younger group, is telling them, no, you need to be the king. You need to take over. You need to enforce this and show them who's boss. And so he listens to the younger generation. He doesn't listen to the older adults. And what happens is that the nations are split. The 10 tribes leave, and they're never reformed. They're never brought back to the southern kingdom. The implications of not listening to our older adults is that the church gets fragmented. And so it's why we need to consider aging as a good thing and consider the wisdom and experience of others. And as we know, we put it in the biblical theology. We know the fall or rebellion, some have called it. We know that aging is also hard because of the curse. We know the burdens. We see and experience the weight of what sin has done in our bodies. And it's hard, and it requires special provision for older adults. Throughout the Bible, the three groups that God consistently speaks to are, does anyone know these? The orphan, the widow, and the sojourner. The fatherless would be the orphan. So orphan, widow, and sojourners. Those were the people who had the least, as they were traveling through Israel, they're the ones who had the least protection. The sojourner could be taken advantage of. Well, we'll trade your money. We'll give you the money that you need to head to Egypt. Don't worry. And they could abuse them in that. The widow had nobody to stand up and take care of her, and she physically wouldn't be able to take care of herself. And then the orphan needed also to be taken care of. So the Lord requires special provision for older adults. And in the work of Christ, who has redeemed us, we have a new identity. And so when we start to think about all those cultural ways of speaking into who we are, Christ speaks into who we are. He tells us exactly who we are to be. Let me read this passage, and I just want to take a moment to talk about this, and actually, hopefully, you all can engage it. This is Matthew 18. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, "Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And calling to him a child, he put him in front of him. That word child, by the way, is tekna. It can mean child as in my 5-year-old. It can mean child as in my 8-month-old. And he put this child, this tekna, in the midst of them and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Now, what's Jesus mean by that? What's he saying about our identities? How does this apply to an older adult? They're talking about children. It's about humility. Yeah, it's about learning, in a sense, being more dependent as a child on your Heavenly Father, humbling yourself to see yourself in light of that, than it is to being the strongest and the smartest and the most theologically astute. It's really about this relational picture. What is a child? A child is someone who's dependent on a parent to take care of them. I mean, even if it's my 5-year-old, but especially my 8-year-old or 8-month-old, it's the only thing my 8-month can do is what? Cry. Do things that we have to change. Eat and cry when she wants us to eat. She can smile a lot. We like to smile. But I mean, think about what that's saying as in terms of our identities. The greatest thing we can do in the kingdom of heaven is to be like that, to be dependent, humble and dependent on a Father who will take care of us. And if that becomes our chief identity, if that is what the greatest is, it means that if you're on your deathbed, or if you are living in the most debilitated state, you have a place. You can be, in fact, the greatest in the eyes of God. We need to take time to think through what greatness looks like in the church and how we speak about greatness. Because I've actually have a number of ruling. I've had teaching elders, but particularly some ruling elders in our community who they have struggled with building their life on their identity as a worker or as and the pastors have done this too, of what I can do for the world in such a way that they are left crippled and depressed. I've got one man that I've been doing counseling with who he says, I can't get up out of bed. His wife forces him to get going on the day, and he lives what he would say in perpetual darkness. I knew this man before he came to Friendship Village. He was one of the most outgoing men in the church that Rebecca and I attended here in town, in St. Louis. Well, what's changed? Well, his identity wasn't ever firmly built on being a child of God first. So this identity piece from what Christ does for us is so important to build our lives on now, because it affects the way we experience loss and experience our own lives in the end of life. So, question. Does God ever say it's okay to retire? Is retirement biblical? What's that? Other side of the Jordan. Yeah. But what were they going to do on the other side of the Jordan? They were going to war on the other side of the Jordan. Now, the war was to walk around the building, or the Jericho. But what's the retirement? I guess the other side is the death. there you go. But the word actually doesn't exist in the Bible. But there is one group of people that is instructed and actually told by God to retire. You know who it is? Yeah, I'm going to just say it's the pastors. You can tell, Russ, he can retire. But that's right. The Levites, the Numbers 8, they were given their service until they turned 50. And then they had to withdraw from the service there. It's the only place in Scripture where the Bible references retirement of some sort. And so just know that that's part of the struggle with, if you retire at 65, the Lord has still called you to do something for the Lord, but your role has shifted. It's changed. You can't do the same things you were doing when you were younger. And so what are those things? Well, we'll get to that in a second. So, and I think we've talked about this. I'm probably going to skip through this real quick. But the Lord calls us to protect the widow in the church, and He calls us to put a high demand on caring for the widow. And then in the consummation, we'll see that we are, that's the wrong verse that I had up there. But in the consummation, we will no longer be the same, and age will be wonderful. And so how do we start to think through integration and application here? And I've got a little bit of time. Well, the first thing that the Lord tells us is to honor our fathers and our mothers, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And many of you have probably heard pastors preach on how this is the commandment with the blessing when you abide in it. Honor them. And so our culture tells us look younger, but the Bible says actually look older. Start to look forward to your older years. Start to look at who those people are becoming, that your identity would start to see them as an opportunity to grow, to be like them. We have youth groups come at Friendship Village fairly often. And one of the things I try and share with those youth is that you might look on your cell phone or on television, if people still watch television anymore, I don't know. And you may look and see a hero that you want to emulate and want to live like. But God actually wants you to look at the people who are godly in your churches and in our community and say, that's what I want to look like. That's how I want to grow in my childlikeness before the Lord. And the Lord actually gives these pictures all throughout Scripture. Leviticus 19 I list not just because of what it says in this verse. You shall stand up before the gray head and honor the face of the old man, and you shall fear the Lord your God. I am the Lord, or fear your God. I am the Lord. The context of Leviticus 19, the Lord's giving special instructions. And He's saying some very strong things like, don't put your daughter into prostitution, and don't deal with necromancy. I mean, very weighty things, and in the midst of it is this command. I mean, it's held on the same regard as get away from the necromantic stuff, the witchcraft, and honor the Lord, or honor the gray head in your midst. And so, as we think about that framework of looking forward, it's a dispositional change in our own hearts. And so, as we're thinking about ministry, and as you all are thinking about ministry here at Twin Oaks, I'd encourage you to think through a full ministry, if not just simply ministry to. We have to have a ministry to, but ministry with and ministry from older adults. So a ministry from older adults, you can see Psalm 92. They still bear fruit in old age. They're ever full and sap of green. That's the righteous who are flourishing because of the Lord's work, that He's upholding them. They still have work to be done. Until the Lord brings them home, until they go home across the Jordan, they still have work to be done. They still flourish. And Henry Nouwen, again, his solution to saying we've become a segregated society is to say that the elderly really must become our teachers again. We've got to start thinking through how to make them the ones that we appeal to in our questions and the new stages that we're finding ourselves in. Something my dad has taught me throughout the years. He's 72 right now. He's still working. But there was a stage in our lives and in my relationship with him where he just verbalized and said, my job is no longer to tell you what's right and what's wrong anymore. I did that for your childhood. My job now is to be the resource that shows you what has worked and what hasn't worked throughout my raising of our family. And so his role, he realized his role has shifted from being the direct judge, right and wrong, to being the teacher of wisdom for me. And we have a family saying, it's not biblical in it, as I've thought about it over the years, it does have some issues to it, but something that we say as a family a lot is a wise man learns from his mistakes, a wiser man learns from the mistakes of others. And I think that has some application here, that part of what my role is as the younger son isn't to just run off and just go live how I want to live. My responsibility of having been given the gift of a godly father who is also a ruling elder in his church is to stop and listen and say, what do I need to learn from you? Even when I disagree, I still need to give a lot of deference to what he says and learn to really seek well to define my disagreements in light of the gospel rather than in just simply dismissing because he doesn't get it. Or he's not facing the cultural challenges that I'm facing today. We really need to learn from them as our teachers. And we need to rest as well in the faithfulness that the Lord will provide and the Lord is using. So how do we also consider this on a more pragmatic level? Well, we have to begin by gifting and looking at ability. There's something older adults can do that we can't do in their wisdom, but there physically may be things that they cannot do. June Tesson was a great example of this, actually. I know she was here as a member. She physically couldn't do much in the last few years of her life. She was wheel-bound to Friendship Village. She wanted to be here. I could tell she loved this church more often, but my predecessor, who was Paul Woodard, some of you may know that name, used to have her come into the library and simply do simple things just to make her know that she has a purpose and help. She would label books for him and help make copies and handouts, things that were legitimate helps to him. But on a deeper level, what happened later in her life is she ended up having to stay in our care center, and she was more physically unable to do stuff, bound to a wheelchair and such. And I came to her one time because there was a volunteer who was from the outside community who wasn't a Christian who wanted to spend time with older adults. And they came in kind of a brash spirit. I think they were coming to say, well, this would be a good service project for me. So I went to June before I talked to him about this, and I said, June, this guy is wanting to come, and he's not a Christian. Would you mind letting him come and just sharing the gospel with him every time he comes. And she said, that sounds like that'd be something I'd be up for, Jake. And so she, in the end of her life, was actually ministering the gospel to a man who thought he was coming to care for her. But there was a sense of evangelism and or discipleship that was happening in that room that June had learned to engage in. She couldn't physically get out to see him, but the Lord had brought somebody to her. And so as we consider our older adults in our midst, sociologists often label them in these three different ways, and they're helpful for us to think through abilities and how we can provide the bridge of relationships, connecting people. I know these are very technical terms of young, old, and oldest old, but they really speak and they're helpful in thinking through, okay, who in our community is retired and independent? They're able to do whatever they want, whenever they want. They're able to drive and they can help out in a lot more physical ways. How many of our community are old? Perhaps they live with a family member, and perhaps they, or maybe they have some disability, such as they're starting to have macular degeneration, or maybe they've just been diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's. So they're not completely independent, but they're still able to do a lot, and there's still much that they can be done. And then oldest old, these are people who are retired, of course, but then completely dependent on other people. And how we engage each one of these is going to look differently based upon our needs as a church and the availabilities of how we can integrate and tie people in to the work that we're doing. And so that's going to take time and energy, and it's hopefully something that your life team will consider helping your church think through. We also need to think through ministry too, and this is often what we think about. Most of the time when I get church calls from churches, it's can we bring our choir around Christmas and sing to the residents? And they love that. That's a great thing. But we also need to be mindful of the persistent needs, and in that, modern healthcare is going to be challenging over the next few years, and probably beyond with the baby boomers. There are large amounts of expensive costs that if someone did not prepare for retirement well, the church really needs to start thinking through, and myself included, how we can care for those in our communities who are going to need special assistance. And the state will provide a number of benefits and opportunities, but that doesn't mean that the funding is always going to be there. And so, if you think about Joseph in the years of plenty and in the years of famine, I think our nation is quickly either ending our years of plenty or we're in the midst of the famine. I'm not sure which one, but we need to be thinking through that level of care. It's the responsibility of the church to care for the widows in our community. You see that in Acts 6. We need to find and think through creative solutions for long-term care. Long-term care insurance is fading away. Just being on the healthcare side of it, very, very few. I think there's one provider that will give long-term care insurance that's unending, and they may have even stopped doing that. Places like Friendship Village, where we have a life contract, are fading away. We're trying to think through how to financially make it viable ourselves, because it's such a challenging thing, the amount of costs and needs. And so the long-term care is if you are an accountant or if you have any financial background, please start considering ways to get involved in these kind of discussions. We need ministry support groups for our older adults. People who've grieved, certainly, but also who are in transition. The thing that we often say at Friendship Village is we're not in competition with other retirement communities. We're in competition with people's homes, because it's much more desirous, and understandably, for you to want to stay in your home. Who wants to give the home up that they've been living in for 50 years and have the memories of all their children growing up in? but it often is a need that people have to consider in giving up that home. And that's a painful process of saying, okay, now I'm going to give this up, say goodbye. And to that end, one just pragmatic thing, that if you have older adults in your midst, or if you take a caregiver for a parent, this in case of emergency thing is really important. We found this out in our community. If you've got a centralized spot, what we do in our communities, we actually have a folder that is magnetic right on our each person's fridge that contains all the medical history, all the meds that they take, all the doctor's information, a centralized spot that if somebody falls or if we have an EMT have to rush in there, they've got a centralized spot to pull everything out of, to look through and go through very quickly. And I just encourage you to consider doing something like that in case of an emergency. You can grab it and go. So those are just some of the things. There's so much more we can consider with ministry too. And then ministry with the desire of the Lord is Psalm 148 here is I think on display. Young men and maidens together, old men and children, let them praise the name of the Lord. God's calling us to an intergenerational worship, which it sounds like is very much a big thing here at Twin Oaks. And I mentioned music before. Ravi Zacharias actually had a really good point, I felt, about music. He said, music is a carrier of memories. If we in our church forget the older hymns, we're amputating them from the past. We're amputating both the older adults from their songs, but we're also amputating the legacies and the stories of God's faithfulness in those songs that are often being written out of sorrow. And so we need to make sure we are integrating them in the life of the church. We need to learn how to be content at every stage of life together. And what I have found is the older adults often have taught me better how to be content with what I have, than as they're learning contentment with what they're losing. There's nothing like going through a grief group when you're pregnant with your wife's pregnant, and we did. If you've done Grief Share, if you've heard of that video, there's all these stories of terrible stories of people losing their babies, and you're processing all of this together. And I was leading a group through Grief Share, and just thinking in my emotional state, we're about to have our first child, and but it's learning contentment to trust the Lord and seeing their brokenness and their pain and what they've endured was an encouragement for us to trust and rest and be content in the Lord. And and we need to be thinking through, I'm sorry I'm rushing through some of these, but I want to give us a chance to maybe talk a little bit. And then we need to think through intergenerational activities together. Since you all are not Kirk of the Hills, and I don't know if there's rivalries, I'll talk about Kirk of the Hills. Years ago, Kirk of the Hills had a program when Vern Trueblood was there. Vern was the one actually telling me about it. He said that they called it the 40s Club. In order to be part of the 40s Club, you had to be married for 40 years. And it was a neat club. I mean, it sounds like it was a wonderful opportunity for those couples to get together and dialogue. The challenge became that he realized as he was older is that none of the younger couples learned how to do marriage, because all of the older couples were off spending time together. There's something wonderful about that, but the challenge of how you disciple your younger generation has to be intergenerational. It has to think through, how can we integrate and show specifically a younger generation how to grow old well, how to endure marital issues. And so intergenerational small groups and intergenerational Sunday school classes like you all have right now, intergenerational dialogue is so important, and you need to continue to think through how to do that well. And so that's about 10 minutes, I think, for questions or so, 10 or 11 minutes. Any comments or thoughts? Any questions? Like I said at the beginning, I see myself as learning this. I'm in process myself. I'm not old yet. I'm still gaining my crown of glory. But yeah.
Rita Hill was a great friend of mine.
Yeah.
And I kind of was disappointed that she beat me in heaven, but anyhow, she said one time one of her grandkids was looking at her face and saying, "Oh, look at that wrinkle." Those aren't wrinkles, those are wisdom creases.
That is so Rita. I have got stories for Rita, but they're not for tape. So that's good.
Yeah. So could you speak to? Obviously there's some tension sometimes in the church where is it the younger generation's responsibility to pursue the older generation and saying we want to have your wisdom, we want to receive it, or is it vice versa, the older generation who pursues the younger and says, "Yeah, I want to mentor you. I want to come alongside of you and share with you since the Lord shared so much with me." Like sometimes there's a gap there of like who pursues who, and maybe it's just a relationship thing of having that opportunity, right? And running after it, but I feel like sometimes someone has to take a step in one direction.
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing I would say is start by praying and just asking the Lord, okay, who are you laying in my life right now that I can either disciple or who I can look forward to being discipled by? And to that end, I'm kind of an advocate that you have to have 3 generations that you're currently always thinking about. Who's in front of me that I'm looking to be like? Who's beside me who can support me and understands what I'm going through? And who am I looking to disciple and think through how to care for? And to that end, I think the question of how are you looking for, say, as a younger generation person, I'm assuming younger generation, as you're looking to someone who's older, there are times and men, especially in the presbytery, who have mentored me probably without calling themselves official mentors. And I think some of it is from me just pursuing them and not asking, will you be a specific mentor to me? But I've named them years down the road. You have been a mentor to me. So Dave Stain, you probably all know Dave. He was here for a long time, and he was the former clerk of our presbytery. And Dave's a talker. If you know Dave, he likes to talk. But when I took that role from him, the thing I said is, I want to have lunch with you on a regular basis. Now, I wasn't calling it a mentorship, but what it was I was sitting down just listening to Dave's heart and just picking his brain about everything he would do on a presbytery level. And I would say he was mentoring me in that role. And I think looking back over the last year or so of doing this, I think he would probably say, yeah, I have been mentoring Jake. I don't know if you'd articulate it at the beginning, but it's hard for older adults to say, I need to mentor you. That's a challenging thing for them to proactively put them out when a culture is saying, are you really that important? Because the risk is, I want to mentor you. Well, I don't want to be mentored by you. Or really, you're going to be the one to mentor me? And there's a scary thing in saying that. And so I think you do need to name it, but I think if you've got that desire to disciple someone or be discipled by someone, really should be looking to spend time with them and pursue them in such a way that maybe you're not labeling it that until after you've spent time, relating and learning or sharing. As I mentioned, my predecessor, Paul Woodard, probably one of the best mentors in my life. He was my boss. He was my supervisor, but he was somebody who was humble enough to disciple me without ever explicitly calling it that. He just wanted to walk alongside me. And if you're an older generation person here, know as well that it's hard for the younger generation sometimes to pursue that because we feel like it's also not our job to enforce ourselves in your lives, but we need it. And we need you to pursue us as well, too. So that's a great question. I don't know if I've really answered it well, but yeah, Carrie.
In what ways can we honor our mothers and fathers, or in what ways are we missing and not doing and honoring our mothers and fathers?
Well, I can speak to cultural, how we're not doing it. I don't know how the church is doing it. It sounds like you all are honoring in many ways. There's another, I can talk about other churches, right? So there's another, I'll say E-Free Church. It's not First E-Free, but there's another E-Free Church in town, and I've got members from that church. And every Sunday, once a year, they have a seniors or older adult Sunday. And they make all the older adults stand up and they hand them roses. Now, something in the mind of that younger pastor was thinking, it'll be really good to recognize the older adults and give them flowers. It's generous. Almost every single one of the residents that did that and came to me the next Sunday and said, it was so embarrassing. It was like they were just kind of band-aiding this. They wanted to do something. They weren't sure what to do, but it was just, they weren't really engaging us. They were making us feel old by standing up in front of the whole church. And I think the question would be, how do we honor? It begins by stopping and listening well to the needs and the desires and the thoughts of our older adults, and finding out, okay, what do they really need? What are they struggling with? And how can we seek to honor them by conveying that kind of love that would meet them with what they actually need, rather than being drawn attention to in this church. They felt like they were being drawn attention that you're old. Okay, for her, I know this resident pretty well, she would have liked to say, okay, Wednesday night, instead of having a Sunday where we're going to all sit, Wednesday night, we're all going to sit at this woman's feet and listen to her stories of when the church was, 50 years younger, and the struggle that she went through and the church went through of how do we remain faithful to the Lord and His Word. And that would have been for her, feeling very honored that the church actually wants to hear those stories, and they want to hear how God was faithful and what they did to shape that next generation from people in the church. So I think it takes knowing our older adults and listening well to them, and then trying to honor them by kind of engaging them with where they're at and what they need. So yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Some of us started a long time ago on the homeschool way of doing education. Along with that came a number of things that you find in homeschooling. One is they have a lot of kids. People think you're Catholic because you've got 6 kids, But when you realized you didn't have to spend as much money in education, it freed people up to have more children. But there's also the mindset that the age segmentation, which particularly is in our school, everybody is 1 year the same age, isn't that desirable in homeschooling circles. You think, no, it's better to have some older and younger together because they learn that way. It seems to me that also provides somewhat of a model of when people get old, they've got a family there as a support network, where if you have the mindset, I'm going to have 1 boy and 1 girl and we're not going to have any more kids, then you're kind of left alone in a sense. Whereas if you have a big family, there's a lot of support there. So just a thought, from an economic point of view, a family can pick up more if you've got a family.
Absolutely. The people who I see are the least supported in our community are the people who did not have children, or they had one child, and that child died, or moved away, and they're kind of left in isolation. We homeschool, so we're grateful for that opportunity. And I'd share that I think Paul in one of his letters to Timothy specifically talks about how to care for widows, and he says, if they're true widows, then let the church take care of them. And what he means by that is it's primarily the responsibility of the children to really care for the widow. That's the default family system, is you should be taking care of your parents. But if they don't have that, that's really the responsibility of the church to step in and care for. So you're right. We have reached a cultural issue, and maybe this is beyond probably the scope of what Carrie asked me to be here. But I'll just say, I think we should be fruitful and multiply. I think we should have lots of kids, and I think our culture says, well, it's up to you to decide your family. Well, if you actually look, it's the Lord in the Scriptures. It's the Lord who creates life. It's the Lord who develops that. And so I would encourage, adoption and us to develop our families so that we have the support and infrastructure. And that's honestly the reason. So this is how it ties into this stage of life. The reason why we have this huge gap between baby boomers and the rest of us, abortion. It is an effect of sin, of corporate sin, that we don't have an infrastructure that's paying Social Security, and we don't have the leaders and the individuals who are hard workers to support the infrastructure of our nation. So, yeah, I think you're right in there. So, was there another question? All right. Well, it is 10:15. Can I close this in prayer? All right. Thank you all for your engagement and your not falling asleep. I actually, when I preach in our first service in our care center, I'm used to people snoring. So thank you. All right, let's close in prayer. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we do thank you in the midst of our culture, which tells us so many lies about who we are and how we ought to live. We thank you for your word, and we thank you for your Son, the fullness of God made flesh. And Lord, in you we find life. So we thank you for our life team here at this church. Thank you for how you are at work in and through your people. And we just continue to ask that you would help us to know how to honor well those who are ahead of us. Father, may we live in light of your gospel each day, not just contemplating who we are in Christ, but who we are as a community in you, that we would seek to serve and to love and to grow in you and grow towards each other. Bless us as we head into worship now. Father, feed our hearts in you as we praise you and as we hear your word. Challenge and equip us for service and love for you. We ask all these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Again, thank you guys.